So thanks a lot for coming out to our session today. My name's Matt Ray. This is Igor. I guess we'll start with some quick introductions. Obviously, this is banking on automation. So, Igor.
Hey, my name is Igor. I'm working with Fastlane Solutions. We're professional services consultancies in Australia, in Sydney. We're chef partners for a few years now. Been doing a lot of work across finance, payments, and insurance industries, and picked up certain similarities in how they work and how they don't really work.
Yeah. So my name is Matt Ray. I've been at Chef for quite a long time. You can tell by our accents, we're both from Australia. I actually moved out to Australia for Chef to start up our APAC business about 3 years ago. So when I got there, initially it was a lot of pre-sales, getting in front of new customers and getting them started. But in the last year or so, I've moved to becoming part of our customer success team. So for our larger customers, we have what we call customer success, which is we help guide our customers down that path. And it just happens to be that a lot of the customers we have in APAC are financial services. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Sometimes it feels like banks don't want nice things. I mean, I earlier asked if anybody worked at banks, and sometimes you roll in and it's not exactly a happy place. And what we want to talk about today is the journey that we're going on with a lot of these companies. And I'm going to say banks, but this is financial services, it's insurance.
Anything regulated, government, you name it.
Yeah, sometimes it feels like government doesn't want nice things either.
Yeah.
But what we see is, there's kind of a difference between when we show up and we're like, hey, let's do the DevOps thing, let's move fast, let's break things, let's get excited about CI/CD and blameless postmortems. And what we run into is people are like, yeah, I've been at this bank for 15 years. 10 years ago, they tried to do Agile training to me. I sat through that. It's gone now. I sat through this training. I outlasted that. And, here you are with your new thing. I'm going to outlive that. We see that. And I've been told that to my face, which was interesting. So there's definitely some skepticism of change. Some of these banks are like, hey, we've been a bank for 100 plus years. Why do we need to change, right? But
yeah. So the experience there is everything that people talk about here at ChefConf. There's awesome vendors at level 7. All these presentations. You step your foot in the bank. None of that exists. None of that is relevant because it's usually, and I've seen some great exceptions from the rule. That usually it's very conservative approach. It's very politically driven and very obviously risk-averse situation and a lot of manual work.
Yeah, definitely a lot of manual work. They still have change review boards. There's still kind of some older patterns at play. But what we see across, we've worked with banks in Australia, Japan, India, New Zealand, Singapore, and other Southeast Asian countries. There's a lot of politics, right? You've got these different silos within the organization. So-and-so doesn't like that manager. This guy doesn't talk to them. You've got a lot of restrictions and audits. Do you want to talk to that? Or
Yeah, again, usual experience is you have 3 silos. One is security, one infrastructure, and one applications, and they all hate each other. Like, when we get them all in a workshop to discuss the new way of doing things, there will be some time spent there when they actually vent out at each other. Because they don't talk a lot for some reason. And what we're trying to achieve every time we start on this journey is to get through to I&O, to app development, to security, that they all should be aligned on a business value, because business doesn't care about VMs, business doesn't care about Java apps, business cares a little bit about exposure and risk, but in general, business needs working service they can charge money for. that's why we're there. That's why everyone is there.
Yeah, and a lot of these organizations have outsourced core functionality. They said, well, we've got a large, provider, large vendor who will handle our infrastructure for us. They'll provide VMs, or they'll provide a stable private cloud where we can roll out our infrastructure, and that way we won't have to worry about IT, right? Because IT is this cost center that if we could just outsource all of it, we could focus on banking. And it turns out that we all know that the real key to success is the applications you provide to your customers. That's the value you provide. And in banking, it happens to be software. Actually, in most companies, it's software. But they're also used to going slow. One of the interesting things was I was helping Fastlane onboard some new folks, and we walked into a bank, and the guys were like, I don't really know what's going on. Things are moving so fast. It's so scary. And then Igor kind of said, don't worry. You're going to be here, and in 2 weeks you'll be up to speed, and in 3 weeks you'll be ahead of everyone else. and it turned out those guys are now the rock stars at this company. But it's kind of a repeating pattern that they're used to going slow, and if you show up trying to change how things work, they're like, well, eventually the gravity of the organization will pull you back in. And it's a constant fight against that, accepting the slowness.
Yeah.
But we also see a lot of similarities in their technology stacks. Compliance definitely rules everything around them, because what happens is, you might have like, oh, we have this new initiative, or we're going to roll this out, and the security and compliance team might show up and say, no, stop what you're doing. This has to get fixed before you work on that initiative, or you might be 3 months into this plan, but you have to change what you're doing because this rule and this requirement over here. That's kind of a reality of what we see. But also, as Barry was talking about this morning, legacy is production. They call them heritage, they call them whatever you want. A lot of these applications have been running for 10, 20 years, right? We see, what do we see? We see Windows NT.
Yeah, my favorite question going into any bank when we start, I always ask them, do you have any Windows NT server in production to this date? And the answer is usually, yeah, we do.
And then they'll say, well, we've got some RHEL and some Solaris, some AIX, and then some HPUX. And they just keep going down the laundry list of things you've heard about. And just this last week, I got asked, what would it take to get Spec working with AS400? And, I actually dug into it, and I was like, well, it's not Unix. And then, yesterday, somebody in the elevator was like, you said it's not Unix. Here's a Unix compatibility layer, and we can get it working. I was like, oh, my God. So, it could happen. You might have Inspec for AS400 at some point. But the fact of the matter is, these customers have, things that, it's hard to hire for. These applications, they're running in production. They're providing business value today. They don't want to touch them, but, they want to keep them running. And so that's, the reality of their infrastructure. And they've got thousands of applications. We saw in the keynote earlier talking about the enterprise application migration, the Windows 2008 migration tool. I mentioned that to one of our customers. They're like, yeah, we probably got 150 of those, right? I mean, it's just, they've got, and of course they all have budget, because as you guys all probably know, 2008 end of life's in January. If you don't know that, you better get cracking. So yeah, that's what we see. But also, most of these shops are on premises. As a customer architect for APAC, I was talking to someone yesterday. I was like, all this stuff about public cloud's great and all, but all my customers run VMware, and none of them are in public cloud. None of them, right? And that might be shocking, to some of y'all. But they're all air-gapped. They might have a small project here or there. They're trying to get some stuff onto, Azure, AWS, or, other public clouds. But the reality is they have really tight restrictions on how their networks are set up, what developers are allowed to do, who's allowed to access what.
Yeah.
I mean, Test Kitchen is frequently not allowed on laptops.
Yeah, we'll talk about that later, but in general, air gap doesn't mean you need to know what proxy to use. it's a policy that says no servers can connect to anything internet at all, and good luck installing Chef Automate in that conditions.
Well, Chef Automate does support air-gapped installs, and
as of now.
our customers were some of the first ones to really push hard on that. So, yay APAC. So what do we do, right? Ideally, we're just going to go in and blow it all up, right? No. Unfortunately, we can't start that way. Like, they've got thousands of applications in production. A lot of these shops, they've been using Chef for years. Maybe 6, 7 years. They've had different outsourcers coming in, different vendors, different folks. A lot of turnover in who did what. Styles of Chef change over the years, but maybe the stacks haven't. But the place we start is with compliance, which sounds kind of obvious, I guess, but what we want to do is identify a compliance use case. We have a customer, a bank that we're working with, and they said, we want to know what our Oracle licensing looks like. And that's something we can solve pretty easily within Spec. But as of, they don't really have any Chef infrastructure yet. They don't have much at all. But this simple use case gives us the path that we want to follow, that if we can get this rolled out, we can show them the answer to their Oracle licensing, which is real business value to them. But as we go through this exercise, we're going to say, well, to roll out InSpec, we're going to need source control. To roll out source control, we're going to need CI/CD. We're going to do things the right way. And as we walk through this and identify all the things that are missing or broken or manual, or it's going to give us our roadmap, or a massive pile of technical
forward. Yeah, I just wanted to add a few things. So it was not particularly Oracle as an Oracle database. It was, we have this massive 20,000 VMs in our data center, and we need to know how many Oracle JDKs or JREs we're running in production because of this new change that Oracle disposed on all of us. So that was real case, like how much money we're going to pay or how we're going to transition from this situation. And another big reason we start with security and compliance is because in general, that's your biggest roadblock. These people, by the nature of their job, they question everything, they want to stop everything, they're very risk averse. And that's the way how we engage them from day one, how we bring value to the security team, to the compliance and governance teams, so they become our biggest friends, and they, in some cases, they become sponsor of Chef rollout in the organization, because we start with InSpec, we start with, okay, let's scan your entire organization for compliance. Chef comes with CIS profiles, baseline 1, 2, let's get it rolling.
Yeah.
And from there, we begin the practice, and from the practice, we then spread it across infrastructure and development teams, which are very happy. They're already on board. They want to do this, but they don't really know how to make it happen.
Yeah, and getting them part of this transformation and how they operate, breaking down those silos, that's fairly important. So part of this initial rollout is we start asking a lot of questions. We want to know how things are done today. And this is just the laundry list of things you have to think about in the enterprise, right? If you are in an air-gapped environment, how do you manage certificates, package repositories, secrets? It's all great when you have SaaSes available and remote repos, but a lot of this stuff is walled off from the world, and they've got complex end-to-end orchestration and scenarios for how code goes from a laptop into production, right? And there's a lot of steps. A lot of times it's manual. And so we need to identify all those things and just understand how change happens inside these organizations. And then, of course, that also leads to what's going on with Chef. As I mentioned, one of the banks we dealt with, they had, I think, 5 different outsourcers who were all touching Chef. And the level of expertise was kind of wild, and the patterns were, I've seen them all now. And so they had every pattern, and they'd invent a couple that you haven't seen at ChefConf. But the before and after the Chef run, a lot of that is the really complicated stuff, right? There's the ServiceNow integrations. There's someone making a change request for how things get into production. All sorts of behind the scenes orchestration about security and firewalls that they don't have anything to do with Chef, but they definitely impact the Chef rollout. How do machines get Chef on them? How is installation provisioning handled? Where do these golden VMs come from? Where did they get their images? These are those sorts of questions that we literally just go through and ask the different teams that are involved. How do you do these things? Which patterns are you using? Do users have access to the Chef server? That's been known to bite us repeatedly. Are they using the managed UI? I've got customers still using compliance and reporting and products that have been end-of-lifed years ago. So we really have to drill into all these things, find out what versions of Chef they're using, what versions of Inspec, if they're using Habitat. It takes a few days, to just get a good understanding of the landscape. But once we have these, understanding of the organization, understanding of their Chef goals and usage patterns, we can start getting to work. So what does that look like? Again, we work with a lot of banks, but they all kind of look the same after a while. The first thing we need is source control. There doesn't seem to be like a one that rules them all, at least across our customer base. It's generally Git, or we're encouraging them to use Git, but that needs to become the single source of truth. Like everything needs to go into source control. Everything as code is the mantra that we're going to keep hammering these guys with. But what we see is some of them have no source control, right? Straight up no source control. And they might have 20,000 servers with no source control. And at some point, I hate to bag on them, but some VMware guy was like, no, just snapshot that stuff, right? I see some nodding heads, but we also see,
the other extreme.
The other extreme.
In the same organization, I was once in 6 or 7 different source controls ran by different development and operation groups. So it was the first time I've seen ClearCase still in production in 2000-something. There's bits and pieces of different Git platforms. There's still SVN, CVS, all that stuff. But what bites us all the time is that there is no enterprise strategy for source control. And my favorite question to ask is, you have all your source control boxes, source control servers, how many of them are actually supported by your operations? Not many.
Yeah.
So then I'm asking, so they are essentially development servers which development team runs Subversion on. So what happens if it goes bust? Do you really lose half of your intellectual property just like that? So that
a reality.
Usually raises some awareness.
Yeah. I mean, and things need to be supported, and it's not uncommon to run into folks who are like, oh yeah, we've got Git, or we bought some GitLab licenses, or Bitbucket, but nobody's actually supporting it. It got installed, it's not maintained, upgraded, managed. It doesn't happen. But a funny, terrible story. I actually ran into a company. They were like, yeah, we've got source control. We've got CVS, we've got SVN, we've got GitHub, we've got some Bitbucket, we've got some GitLab. And then, I was like, okay, we'll get this sorted out. We'll get you focused on Git. And I was like, can I see, some of your Chef infrastructure? And, he's like, oh yeah, let me just pull it up. And he typed in SSH root at chefdk.company name. And this box, he SSH'd in his root and was on a box called ChefDK. And there was a list of data centers. And he would CD into the data center directories, and there was a directory of Chef code, and he would edit it on the box and knife push. And literally, those boxes were not under source control. The box name was ChefDK. He's like, oh yeah, we use ChefDK. That box has ChefDK on it. And that's horrifying. Yeah. But, it's a reality.
Yeah. And code reviews, we put it very specifically there because I'm tired of organizations that run trunk-based development on Git. but there are so many of them.
Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with trunk-based development if you're using pull requests to merge back into master, right?
No,
But
everyone's
just committing.
Everyone's pushing to
Yeah.
master. That's what they call trunk-based development.
Yeah. So source control, very important. Which leads, of course, to CI/CD. And I say Jenkins because there are 100 choices when it comes to CI/CD, but every single one of my customers uses Jenkins. Which, good or bad, it is what it is. But the real point of your CI/CD is it needs to become the workflow for how code goes from source control to becoming consumable. We want this to produce artifacts. We don't want it to be your orchestrator. And when I say I want to produce artifacts, I mean your Jenkins pipeline will pop out cookbooks or pop out Policyfile archives or Habitat archives. We don't want to then end it with knife push to a box. And the reason we generally don't want this is because a lot of these organizations, Jenkins is sitting on some privileged server, and then they've got 20 data centers that Jenkins can't reach, right? And so we'll talk about that pattern a bit, but we want to move things to hey, if we can go to artifact-based development, we'll see how that looks here in a little bit. But this is another place to put more access controls, right? We want to take our security and restrictions for who can touch what, move it into source control, move it into our CI/CD, put our code reviews in Jenkins. Make sure that as much as we can, we push things into source control and our CI/CD so everyone has a same pattern for getting things into production. But what I've really found is, despite being kind of the best automation or the first choice of automation platforms, Jenkins is kind of hard to automate. What we generally see is people, they've got a Jenkins server, and I'm like, is it under source control or CI/CD? And it's not. It was set up, and people are manually adding pipelines, and Jenkins is like this gap in coverage for CI/CD. And again, it needs to be supported. There are a fair number of these shops where somebody set up Jenkins, everyone uses it, and nobody supports it. So it's this tragedy of the commons where, Jenkins needs to be upgraded forever. And that's kind of the state we're in. And I think kind of one of the best things that could happen to Jenkins is if the internet forgot the last 10 years of Jenkins, and anytime you did a Google search for Jenkins you only saw the last year. But Igor showed me the other day.
the way around that.
This used to be little tangent here. And Google, when you search for something, over on the far right, it says tools. You can say, only show me results from the last year. So that used to be more prominent in the UI. It's over there now. But, God, it saved me so much time. So Jenkins. There's other tools, but that's generally, it's always Jenkins. Artifact repositories. Again, not everybody has one, but everyone who we see typically has Artifactories. And for good reason, it's a pretty good product. But this is going to be the destination for your code-derived artifacts. We want one centralized place to put things, right? And it's going to have your Chef installers. It'll have your RPMs, your Ruby gems. We want to put our Policyfile archives in there. We want to put our cookbooks, our compliance profiles. Everything goes into one artifact repository, which is another place you can put access controls and security over, so you can track who has access to what. We don't want people pushing stuff in directly into Artifactory. If we can avoid it, we want everything coming through CI/CD. But one of the other things we see about Artifactory is people don't really take advantage of it.
Yeah, so it's usually there's Artifactory and then or Nexus, and then there's separate Docker registry, there's separate Chef supermarket or something else. And again, the way we approach it, and it's a very intricate discussion with security team at this point in time, because they hate the idea of proxy repository that can download your dependencies from open internet. That's one thing, but when you twist this discussion into this becomes dual gateway. So first we decide what can and cannot get into organization as a dependency in the first place, because we normally turn off the proxying repositories and we get all dependencies manually. And then there's another level of what can actually be used in production. So there's normally, for each repository, be it Docker registry, Chef, or installation packs, there's always, this is development and this is production, and Artifactory and supports it really well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Artifactory is fairly inexpensive and works really great.
Needs to be supported.
Yeah, and again, it needs to be supported. It's one of those things that gets tossed up, and then people forget that this thing needs to be backed up and have a DR story around it.
And Artifactory loves running out of disk space because of what it is.
Yeah. Which brings us to the Chef server. So the Chef server, the pattern that we're espousing with these organizations is we want to make the Chef server artifact-driven, and we don't want humans on the boxes, right? So one of the things we find is people with knife access will upload cookbooks or try to get around this whole CI/CD that we put in place. And configuring the Chef server to work with LDAP or whatever your auth tool is of choice, it's pain. It's one more thing to deal with. And so the pattern that we've been espousing is let's have the Chef servers fully automated, where the Chef client manages them. And so we have a cookbook that a couple of different banks have been working on together. It's currently in my namespace, but it's up on Supermarket, called the Managed Chef Server Cookbook. And the whole point of this is it handles the installation, upgrading, backups, tuning, maintenance of your Chef server, but it also has loaders that it goes to a mounted file system, Artifactory, and looks in a directory and says, all these policy files, I'm going to upload them. Or all these cookbooks, I'm going to upload them. Or whatever's in there, I'm going to upload them. And then when a Chef node gets dropped into this data center, it says, hey, Chef server, I was told this is the policy file for me. What do you have? And it loads it down to them. The nice thing about this is I talked, one of the banks I'm working with, they have 20 data centers. And so they have one centralized Chef server that manages the other 40. They have a prod and a non-prod Chef server in each of these data centers. Those Chef servers are, it's air-gapped, but they have firewall rules allowing them to talk to that Chef server and to talk to Automate. None of the nodes in the data center can leave their data centers. They can't talk to anything else. There's an Artifactory proxy, caching proxy in like each data center. So we have the centralized Artifactory, pushes things down. It's completely automated. And so we don't need HA. If you lose this thing, it can rehydrate in less than 5 minutes. Installation is fully automated. Backups are automated. Typically, they're running on top of VMware, so they're running SRM. So if something happens to the box, it's going to get brought back up really fast anyway. Their SLAs were typically like 2 or 3 hours, and I was like, we can put it back up in 5 minutes, and from scratch, or SRM will just move it around and it'll be fine. And so these servers become stateless. But what we don't want to do is give humans access to it because they'll monkey around with things, which means we typically don't turn on the manage UI at all, which also makes sense because we don't, for some of these customers with 20 data centers, do they want to run 20 manages? Does somebody need to go and log into all these? We don't want that. So that's the pattern that seems to work really well. And it, when you've got 41 Chef servers deployed, that saves you a big HA bill too, because instead of running 41 servers, that would turn into 123. And we kind of ran through some of the CapEx, OpEx numbers, and the server cost from their outsourced supplier was way more than their Chef licensing. So again, this is the pattern that we're going with them. And then that also leads to a Chef Managed Automate as well. The Managed Automate Cookbook handles installation, upgrades, tuning, maintenance, and backups of their Automate. It has a recipe for downloading air-gapped installations and doing upgrades of upgrades and installs from the air-gapped installers. And so the customers generally throw these air-gapped installers into Artifactory, right? And then the Chef client can go and rehydrate an automate server if they need to. This is less stateless because you've got all that data, right? You've got 9 months of automate data in their case, which still takes a lot of servers. But this is the pattern that kind of goes forward with them. And all these banks have a wrapper cookbook around the managed Chef server and the managed automate because they've got to deal with all the things that we saw, like certificates, security, in the case of automate, LDAP and access controls. And that's all, you still have to maintain that yourself, but at least there's a nice place to have kind of a managed experience that at least, other banks are using. And, when we go to these different customers, like, yeah, we saw that. Here's how, this bank did it. Here's how that bank did it. Call them up. The source is all on GitHub. And we actually get them talking to each other, which is kind of fun. So that's the approach that we take to this infrastructure. And generally, automate lives somewhere central where lots of things can talk to it. Or, well, all the Chef servers can get to it because they're going to proxy up their data. And one of the things that, when we started working with these organizations that had, all these different patterns of Chef usage, we kind of sat down, and some of these started maybe 2.5 years ago, where we looked at all the patterns and we're like, well, what are the most forward-looking patterns of Chef today? What can we get you towards? And just kind of casually mentioned, well, there's this thing called Policyfiles, and 2 years ago, Policyfiles were kind of rare. Usage of it was kind of on the experimental side of things, but I was kind of afraid to introduce it because it had some new patterns. There wasn't a lot of documentation. There was still a lot of rough edges to it, but it solved a lot of real problems, especially when it comes to things like roles and environments. They're unversioned, right? So chances are good that if you're using these, you might not always know what's in production, right? And if you're using Berkshelf, you can get non-deterministic behavior depending on, as you roll out to 20 different data centers with 20 different Artifactory caching proxies, you might get different versions of cookbooks depending if there's some sort of race condition.
I have my favorite horror story about roles and environments in Berkshelf, where the entire production provisioning system went down. Nobody could spin up a server for more than a day while we were investigating what was going on. And essentially there was one little cookbook with some sort of low-level utilities like Code Sugar or whatever, which wasn't updated that often, but that day it did, and it's made its way into production Chef servers via Berkshelf update, and lo and behold, we found out that nobody actually pinned the version of that little cookbook because it was so small, and of course the next version was incompatible with anything that was currently running. And it broke the whole thing because Chef just picked up the latest version of that third or fourth level of dependency. So that can never happen with Policyfiles at all because you have the whole bundle in the same archive.
And there's a lot of usage patterns that we've kind of uncovered around how Policyfiles get rolled out. One of the things that the banks generally try to stick with is always using the latest version of a policy file unless you don't need to use the latest version of a policy file, which, getting them used to the idea of running latest by default, that took a little bit of pushing. But, we got them, thinking, well, if it's going through our CI/CD, it's getting tested, we have non-prod environments, the latest should be safe, right? If we build up all this muscle around continuous integration, continuous delivery, these things should be okay. And then, one of the other things that, kind of sounds obvious now is like, well, you don't have to pin your cookbook versions. You can, but at the very minimum, you should always pin on at least the major versions. So if somebody says, oh, major release of this cookbook, let's tap the brakes at least, but still try to run the latest if you can. And then when it came to things like policy names and policy groups, we stuck with the default name, which is and with roles and environments, if you don't define your environment, you get underscore default. We kept that around because a lot of the Chef tooling, if you're using policy files, it'll show up under environments as the policy group. So we're just trying to say, like, don't use a policy group unless you need a policy group. And so that's actually worked out fairly well. And the place to start is something minimal. In this case, they started with all their Chef Automate and Chef Server infrastructure. So there are policy files included in those cookbooks that manage those pieces of infrastructure. And that's generally where they've started. And then, of course, what do the pipelines look like? And what do our repos look like? So generally, we kind of call it, it's not a mono repo, but it's mono repo-ish. We have one big Chef repo that holds things like data bags and policy files. But we want to keep our cookbooks and our compliance profiles separate. Right? The cookbooks, sometimes they're taking community cookbooks, but they want to bring those into CI/CD so they can have the same rigor of testing if they want to upgrade them at a later time. And the compliance profiles, you can have some in-spec with your cookbooks, but generally if you're checking production systems, you want to make those separate compliance, those compliance profiles separate repositories. So the in-spec with your cookbooks is for testing the cookbook, but testing things like an application or some piece of infrastructure, give it a separate repository. A lot of these folks, they don't have CI/CD around provisioning and imaging yet. Like, where do you get your core image? Oh, our outsourcer provides us a Windows 2012 R2 build that's completely opaque. But it takes a while, but we slowly get them to give us the keys to how those images are built. Provisioning, I think I got a slide about that later. It's still kind of a mixed bag. And those pipelines, of course, are going to have dependent pipelines that trigger more builds. And the policy files are going to depend on the cookbooks and compliance profiles that they include, and they get those artifacts out of Artifactory, right? And so there's some example pipelines available on GitHub, which is where we get these nice diagrams that were done with Jenkins Blue Ocean. Compliance profiles, you have a pull request, inspect check, Rubocop, code review, published Artifactory, commit back to master. Fairly straightforward kind of pipeline. Cookbooks, if you'd used delivery or kitchen or any of the local testing, it's chef spec, cook style, food critic, kitchen, code review, push to Artifactory.
Yeah. And on that note, we usually recommend organizations to set up their own library of food critic rules.
Yep.
They take the default whole lot, figure out what's relevant, and add to it. There are a few great examples on GitHub from certain vendors.
Yep.
And Test Kitchen, that's actually the huge pain point in any regulated organization, because you go there, you start talking to developers, oh, we can't run any kind of virtual machine on our laptop because it's all locked down and there are policies preventing any virtualization on the laptop specifically. So your kitchen test does not exist. And the way around that is to liaise with infrastructure and operations. So ideal situation that we were able to achieve multiple times is a slice of the data center, completely segregated segment, where where you can use kitchen drivers for either VRA, VRO, or vSphere directly, or OpenStack, whatever they give you. So you can still run kitchen test from the laptop, but what happens is it connects to the data center provider, spins up the VM there, and tests it outside.
Yeah. So policy files, fairly simple pipelines. The key is we're going to commit the Ruby and the lock JSON back into source control. The lock JSON, humans aren't generally looking at that, but you're going to want it for debugging, historical reasons, just so you have them. And the locks and the archives, again, go into Artifactory. Data bags, this is why we still have Chef servers around, is because generally they're using search or data bags. But we want to manage this through code as much as we can. And we encourage our customers to move their secrets to something else, not to start with Chef Vault if they haven't been using it, but to look at alternatives like HashiCorp Vault, Some of them do use CyberArk. Provisioning, we always talk to them and they're like, oh yeah, we'd love to get on Terraform. But generally, they've got some homegrown tool that they're using or a very manual process around VMware, VRA, VRO, very popular. Whatever we can do, if we can move it into source control, this is a big win. But this is one of the last hills to take when it comes to these organizations because they don't have pipelines for them. So we definitely need to push on that. Change windows and push jobs. This is sometimes a necessary evil in these organizations. They've got release schedules when things are allowed to go out or when things are allowed to be upgraded.
Yeah, so we explored this multiple times and got one successful production implementation of that. Big issue with Chef Push is that it needs some credentials to the Chef server to work with that. So our solution to work around that was running Jenkins pipeline that will kick off a push job and some custom code around that to manage what exactly Chef client run will look like on pre-select fleet of nodes.
Yeah. I mean, some of these use cases can be dealt with through the effortless infrastructure pattern. If your updates are available in Builder, you could say, well, it's 2 o'clock, hit promote, right? But again, there's a lot of customization depending on what the customer is doing here. But again and again, everything, and that's kind of a different approach for some of these organizations, is they're not used to having things as code. And so we have to keep hammering on this again and again and again. But we have had some successes that we've gotten to talk about. Haventec is one that Fastlane and Chef have worked with.
Yeah, Haventec is a local Australian startup that's very well funded and has a very great use case. They have a product in security that decentralizes your passwords and essentially removes honeypot password database from your data center, and another around payments where it splits your credit card information and decentralizes this as well and keeps user in control. So we came in, we built them full DevOps CI/CD, including cloud, including builds, everything. We put in secure by design thinking into it, and we put in Chef and locked out everyone from SSH completely, raising an alarm if someone goes into AWS console and enables SSH port. Yeah. And then this happened.
Yeah. So we've got a use case and our customer.
So if we look at risk and compliance, this solution was really important for us. The auditor was sitting with our team saying, okay, and what about direct access, SSH access to machines? Our team were able to turn around and say, well, because Chef is agent-based, we've actually been able to disable all direct access to all production servers and all production applications. And the auditor looked at us and looked at the report on compliance book and started crossing out complete sections of the PCI spec saying, well, none of this applies to you anymore. We don't need to worry about this because if you have no direct access, then we haven't got any requirement to manage access and manage keys, etc. The thing that really sealed it for us there, though, was the fact that Chef Automate will alert us at any time if someone tries to turn that capability on.
Yeah. And so one of the great things about Haventec is they achieved their PCI compliance in kind of record time, which was a nice story. So going forward with these organizations, the patterns that we're getting them into now are around effortless compliance because, again, we start with compliance. And this is, as we saw in the demo during the keynote, Habitat managing InSpec and the compliance profiles, separating InSpec away, our audits away from Chef, allowing us to go and tackle infrastructure that's not managed yet. Machines that, Windows machines, Linux machines that don't have Chef on them yet, perhaps they have other tools, but allows them to get compliance coverage of those boxes immediately. And again, everything as code, which the next step, of course, is effortless infrastructure, getting Habitat managed Chef onto these machines, simplifying how we deploy, update, provision, all the things that we've had trouble with in these organizations, and everything being done as code. Again, this pattern leverages Policyfiles, can work with the Chef server, It doesn't by default, but it can. And actually, in one of these customers, their outsourcer said, well, Chef sets up the boxes, but you can't have access to that Chef client. And they're running like Chef 12 or something, giving them everything up to their application layer. But then they wanted to use Chef to configure things for their application as well. And the vendors told them, well, you can't have that. When I showed them this, they said, so we can have 2 Chef clients. And you can. You could potentially have multiple ones. But in this case, they actually had a valid use case for having 2 Chef clients on a box. But again, everything goes back to code. And then this gives way to Habitat. We saw the enterprise application stack migration. Lots of these banks have a lot of older Windows applications, older RHEL. They want to move to new platforms. This pattern is going to help them out. And even though some of their techniques seem a little older, they are starting to finally move into Docker and Kubernetes. And this gives them the same approach to managing their compliance, their automation, and their applications with the same platform. And so this is this has turned out quite well, because some of them have actually rolled out Kubernetes initiatives already. And then we showed up with Habitat. They're like, you would have saved us so much time. All these things that we built from scratch for ourselves, and now we have them on the same pattern, and folks are getting pretty excited about Habitat. So that's that. Any questions? Yes. Oh, Mike.
What's your reasoning behind saying not to start off with Chef Vault and go right into HashiCorp Vault or another solution?
Yeah. So Chef Vault is an interesting application. It wasn't initially written by Chef. It was something we adopted from our customers because there was kind of a hole in the market, right? We had customers saying we need to manage secrets or sensitive data, and we see that you've got a private public key infrastructure already set up. This is a good place to manage our Chef secrets. And it's fine on smaller installations, but there's some race conditions that you start to run into at larger deploys. And it's not something that Chef has ever really prioritized as like, hey, we want to get into that market. And HashiCorp Vault came later. It's a really great open source project. And there's a commercial company that wants to make sure that it's really useful. CyberArk is similar. And so we don't really have any qualms about recommending great open source projects to replace something that doesn't get a lot of love from Chef engineering.
But ironically, there's another keynote today about running Chef Vault at scale.
Yeah. But I'm not going to spoil their talk.
It's a HashiCorp presentation.
Yeah. Well, and Hashi has had some presentations here too. So I'm not going to spoil their talk, but I bet they talk about things like race conditions and dealing with these things. And it's never been a strong focus of ours, and it's not somewhere commercially that we were interested in pursuing. So, customers use it, but there's free alternatives. So that's kind of our take on Vault. And surprisingly, one of the banks I dealt with, they were all in on Chef Vault, and then they started running stuff on Kubernetes, and then they started putting Chef client keys into their Kubernetes Docker nodes so they could talk to Vault. And so now you've got next gen infrastructure talking to this, and they ran into a lot of race conditions as they started to spin up, we've got 800 new nodes, Docker instances spinning up and hitting Chef Vault, and none of them use Chef. So they had some other tooling to create keys for them. And it's this whole thing we never intended any of that, right? So now they switched to Hashi. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes. Mike?
You mentioned using Jenkins as an orchestrator not being the optimal idea, but
Yeah.
you didn't suggest a reading list of ones we should look at.
Yeah, well, kind of the orchestration we want is pull-based, right? We want Chef to be our orchestrator. So rather than have, hey, this cookbook pops out of the pipeline, and we want, and this policy file archive is updated, and we want it to be loaded, we just have the Chef client running on our Chef servers every 30 minutes So you're going to get convergence across these Chef servers. Then when a node, so you might have up to an hour lag, depending on how frequently you update. If your clients update every 30 minutes and the Chef server updates every 30 minutes, it could be as long as an hour before they get that update. Banks are generally okay with that, right? There are use cases, we talked about some of the push job stuff, where they're like, no, it has to go out at 2:01. Yeah, we'll work with you and sort those things out. But generally, they're okay with the pull model because it just gets rid of access controls, and that's the real pain, is managing compliance. If we can keep humans away from boxes, all the better, right?
Other side of orchestration is whatever happens before and after Chef run. Setting up remedy requests, CRQs, registering, getting Active Directory tokens, pre-registering, and then making sure everything actually did register in all appropriate spots. Again, Jenkins seems to be an inadequate solution for that because the complexity of the scripts around there is tremendous. So our recommendation usually either use VRO, which is VMware product, vRealize Orchestrator, or proper BPM solution. There are plenty of them on the market.
Yeah. So, got another question?
One last question, probably.
Imagine if you have a server that is being managed, like an application that's being managed with Chef Client on an older version of Chef.
Yep.
What would be your advice to upgrade? Would you first do the habitat thing with the application and then upgrade the client, or what would,
No. I mean, we would probably first we'd wrap it with some compliance, right? You have an application that's running, working, and you know what that looks like, and so we want to put InSpec on it so we can see what it looks like when it works. And so if it's too old a version of Chef, maybe it doesn't support the audit cookbook, which is a nice opening for Habitat managed InSpec, the effortless compliance pattern. That way you can see what it looks like when it's working. Then you can say, well, we've got this recipe, bring it into our CI/CD, try bumping it up, the Chef client version, under a nice controlled environment in Kitchen. This is all foreign to some of these banks, right? They're like, oh, we weren't using Kitchen, or we weren't using, testing, and so that's generally the approach, is like, well, let's see what happens if we bump up your version of the Chef client. And so some of the banks we've worked with, we went from 12 to 12 latest to 13 latest to 14 latest, and you have to do all these steps to get them there. But then once you kind of unlock the effortless infrastructure pattern, now you have your Chef client and it's run tightly coupled, independent of what's on the OS, and it kind of unlocks the ability of like, well, we might have different versions of Chef running in different places in our infrastructure for whatever reason, but that's where we're kind of trying to take them, is they can test these upgrades independently. So the thing is, like, none of this is a silver bullet. It's like, it's a fight. It takes a long time. But
Right.
Yep.
One last question.
One last
probably.
question.
So regarding the Chef client upgrades, especially in an air-gapped environment,
Yeah.
I come from a bank. So why is there any thought process to include the gems which are needed for Chef client upgrades along with the Chef package itself? Because getting those gems installed before or during the upgrade process is a pain. Mm-hmm. Is there any thought process around it?
Well, if you've got CI/CD in place, you can go into Artifactory and like, well, here's the latest version of the Chef client. We'll put this in here. We'll bump it in our CI/CD, and it goes into Kitchen and blows up because it's missing a bunch of gems. So then we go back to find those gems. We put them into Artifactory, restart the job. It gets a little bit farther, blows up, rinse and repeat, right? And it is kind of tedious and manual, but it's predictable, right? And it's that's the best thing you can give them is predictability. So yeah, just having things penned is a big win. So I don't have a great answer.
That's fine.
So
All right.
thanks a lot. We'll clear clear out for the next one. If anyone has any questions, we'll be.
Thanks all for coming. We'll be around. Thank you.